Right. Doop. All right. Hello, everyone. This is Tripp, and I am here with Jeffrey Pugh. The good doctor is in the house, and pretty excited about this. We have a whole bunch of different topics and questions that y'all have sent in. People from the Bonhoeffer and the Future of Faith group. In the chat box for this, and in the email I just sent a little bit ago, there's a PDF that is an outline of Bonhoeffer's life. So you've heard a number of times different stories. Or he's in Spain here, or the underground seminary, or when things are happening in Germany, and when texts are written. We thought that would be a helpful way of having that handy, so you can locate points in the story. So you can download that PDF or pull it up and such. Anyway, today, since we're going to be doing Q&A stuff and things, we'll be jumping around topic wise. But if you're on here and didn't send in questions in advance and you have them, feel free to drop them in the side, put the word question before it so I know to star it and can save it, and we try to come back to things. But since last week we were hanging out with Reggie Williams, and at the end he mentioned a Bonhoeffer movie in the works, which Jeff got a little worried going on across his face and such. I thought I thought that was all the provocation needed for Jeff to kick things off, because since then the thoughts have been rolling through his head. So I'm going to let Jeff take over, tell us what was going through his head then and such, and then we'll start digging in to different topics. So yeah, Jeff. Well, what are you worried about? Come on.
Well, okay. First of all, I want to apologize to our audience today. I have been struggling with pleurisy for the last 3 to 4 weeks, and it has moved into the position where I find myself having to cough a lot and hard to finish sentences. So if in fact that starts to happen to me, which just did, I might have to mute my mic and turn it back over to Tripp. But let's go back to the movie for just a minute. So when Reggie was telling me a whole nother movie about Bonhoeffer was coming out, my immediate reaction was, "Oh, I hate it already." And that was driven by, in some senses, the reality that there's a certain hagiography that has built up over the years around Bonhoeffer, from all ends of the theological spectrum. So, there's a kind of Bonhoeffer the martyr, Bonhoeffer the saint, Bonhoeffer this and that. And this has distorted, I think, our view of Bonhoeffer the human being in pretty significant ways, and has led to no small amount of discussions and debates in Bonhoeffer circles about how we are to understand Bonhoeffer. So, much of this is understandable. We are always looking for heroes. Bonhoeffer's story is compelling. I said on an earlier episode that I thought that it was more important for us to or it was as important for us to pay attention to his theology as it was to his life story. But his life story is really where the multitudes of people are gathering to find out about Bonhoeffer, to listen to him. And so we're looking for those heroes. I was looking for heroes. That's why I chose Barth for my dissertation. That's why I chose Bonhoeffer for my lifelong interest after that. And so there's a certain sense in which, it's a understandable impulse within us. The kinds of contradictions that are part of Bonhoeffer's life, the kinds of flawed places, they don't actually sort of emerge as part of his story. So often, um, you know, he was an extraordinary human being in an incredibly difficult time, which is one of the things that I think is his attraction. And that extraordinary time causes both him and many others to make compromises in their life that I think we have to take account of. So the story is more complex than we think. And if we just take the time from 1933 to the end of the war in Germany, we find a church that had compromised itself. And Bonhoeffer is trying to respond to this. And sometimes he actually runs away. So he runs away to the London pastorate. Then he runs away to America in 1939. But the powerful aspect of his life, and this is one of the sort of moments in his life when I find myself kind of in awe, is when he's safe in America. He's got a position that's going to keep him out of the war. It's going to keep him out of the German military. And he decides that he cannot stay in New York City. He must return to Germany because he cannot rebuild the nation. He cannot participate in the healing of Germany unless he participates in his suffering. So you see that I see as a kind of a very powerful moment in Bonhoeffer's life. But if we don't then look at what happens as a result of that decision, his movement into the conspiracy, other kinds of things like this, then in fact, I think we come away with a Bonhoeffer that is a little shaded. And that's the great power of the Bonhoeffer stories, that everybody, oh my God, everybody finds something in him that they're going to want to acknowledge, or they're going to want to cling to, or they're going to use as justification for what they've done. And Bonhoeffer himself is a man of contradictions. Some people say, oh, Bonhoeffer stood up for the Jews. That's a complicated story, because Bonhoeffer, in his 1933 essay, The Church and the Jewish Question, he's flat out Christian supersessionist. The Jews suffer what they do because they put Jesus to death. He's, the Christianity has superseded Judaism. That's a complicated story. Yad Vashem will not declare Bonhoeffer a righteous Gentile. The Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem will not declare Bonhoeffer a righteous Gentile, because there's really, other than maybe Operation 7, there's really no sort of evidence that Bonhoeffer specifically spoke up for the Jews. That's a complicated story. Some people argue that what he did was more than anybody else was doing at the time. But certainly what we can know and understand is that Bonhoeffer changed his understanding of Judaism by the time he was executed. So when I'm thinking about a movie about his life, do those kinds of complications, do those kinds of complexities, do those kinds of struggles make it into a movie that would do justice to Bonhoeffer, the human being, and and be able to portray him in such a way that he doesn't become the cartoon figure of Eric Mataxis, or any others. And I want to just go ahead and say, the conservative Bonhoeffer is there. It's in his writings. In one of the spaces that we gave people for one of the readings that we gave people for ethics, I think ethics is formation. There's a part in there where Bonhoeffer says that after the war, Germany might have to be led by a kind of aristocracy, and that democracy wouldn't be able to be a part of German society until after they had washed out Nazism from the system. So patrician, he's, he there is a conservative aspect of him, very much so, but he has, at least in the American context, been enlisted in the culture wars to an extent that, if that's the movie you're going to make about Bonhoeffer, that he was involved in the culture wars of Germany in 1930s, then I'm just a little bit skeptical. That's all. Let me stop there.
Oh no, and I think that one of the things that is kind of permanently fascinating to me about Bonhoeffer is we know enough of his story, his context. We know the people involved, that those complications, those struggles and such, and how he's changed his mind and things. We have a lot clearer picture of him doing it than we do in a lot of figures in church history. Like we could think of Augustine shifts his mind quite a bit, and yet we don't have a lot of biographical information for him after Confessions, but we know the Donatist controversy shaped how he ended up functioning as a bishop afterwards, and these kinds of things. With Bonhoeffer, between his narrative is so compelling, and you see these complications and struggles, and I wonder if this is true for everyone, but for me, part of what makes him enduringly fascinating and challenging is you see that there's struggles. A lot of individuals who you can look up to, or, oh, they're a brilliant theologian, or, oh, they were faithful in this difficult time and challenging circumstance. You don't get the fullness of their humanity. And I think with Bonhoeffer, we have a lot thicker account of him and the struggle. And that in some sense makes me want to trust his intuitions and the struggle, trust where he's going, because I've seen the struggle and those that kind of complicated nature.
Yeah, and this is one of the reasons. I mean, of course, with the publication of the Dietrich Bonhoeffer works and the Dietrich Bonhoeffer works in English translated, we have, letters and, from his former students, letters to him to his students. And so there's all kinds of struggle on all sides. And, but the thing about it is that as he's fashioning his theology from 1933 until his death, I think there's an aspect of that I don't want to just say, well, that theology happened because of his struggles, right? Because then we can discount it. Well, in when time isn't in crisis, we don't need a crisis theology per se. But I do think that we have a lot of biographical information about him, right, that we just don't have about other figures in church history. We have a lot in some ways about Barth, but maybe not as revealing from Barth's end of things as from Bonhoeffer's. Sorry.
Oh no. So I know we got a bunch of different topics that came in, and there were a number of them that come out of people from people who may not be familiar with the larger theological conversation that's taking place in Bonhoeffer's time, much of which I think lingers up to the present. and so there were a couple questions around how Bonhoeffer understood Scripture. There were a couple that were specifically in relationship to like what he talks about in in his engagement with like creation and the fall. Others about the references to people like Bultmann in Letters and Papers,
Mhm.
and the historical critical method, and the version of this that seems to touch on all of it is let's see. I'd love to understand how the German Christians in Bonhoeffer's world understood the authority of Scripture and its relationship to critical scholarship, because I so easily read his confident talk as a Christian theologian in much of his early work, with the background hum of American evangelicalism. Yet it's clear he engaged in critical historical scholarship. I saw references to Bultmann, which I know I'm not supposed to like as a Baptist. Um, the father, demythologizing. And
I just let me jump in here for a
yeah,
second. I have never heard of a more Baptist theologian than Rudolf Bultmann. If you, I mean, if you read his commentary on John, for instance, you must give your life to Christ. You must make a decision for Jesus. I mean, it is decisionism all down the line with Bultmann, and I'm not necessarily a great Bultmann fan, but when you read his stuff, he sounds like a evangelical.
oh yeah.
It's really crazy.
Look, I had heard things about Bultmann and never read him, and an undergrad did, and I was like, what's the big deal? What are people scared of? Like, if you're already comfortable with the historical critical stuff, he's hardcore. But let's assume people don't know German Christianity, liberal Protestantism shaping it and such. Like, what would have been the conversations around biblical authority at his time, that then he's wrestling with, right? When you start to get him picking up on, talking about the demythologizing, we get references to Von Rad and biblical history and such.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure I'm the most qualified to answer that. But I'm just going to go ahead and say that the way that Bonhoeffer looks at the biblical text is that it is revelatory, but it does not necessarily have to be historical. Um, you know, uh, there Bonhoeffer would not see Scripture, I think, in the way that many of us would see it. He sees it as authoritative, and if you want to take a Lutheran move to this, Scripture is authoritative because it is the cradle of Christ. It is the witness. It bears witness to Christ. Bonhoeffer, uh, I think, follows Barth in this in some ways, and I'm happy to be disabused of this. I may get this wrong, but what we have in the biblical text is witness to the Word of God. It is not the Word of God itself. So there's a certain sense in which I think for Bonhoeffer, he does take into account, um, you know, text criticism, historical criticism. He does look at the text in light of those things. He does see certain things about the text that are important. And yet, there's a way in which he sort of moves through that to say there's something important going on in this text where the transcendent, in some ways, is being revealed to us in the decisions that people are making, in the understandings of the divine and the relationship and the encounter with God that people have in the text. And so that's why he can come out, for instance, in discipleship, and he does sound very. That's why evangelicals far more find a home with Bonhoeffer in the call to discipleship and life together, because for them at least, the biblical call is very strong. The appeal to the Sermon on the Mount and the simple following. But if you're kind of looking carefully, is Bonhoeffer, and I don't know this, I mean, maybe a better Bonhoeffer scholar than I can take care of this, is Bonhoeffer doing the same thing that Bultmann is doing in his commentary on John when Bonhoeffer says, you must decide. It is, you must do. It is not enough to, live into the theory. The Sermon on the Mount is to be lived, is to be practiced. It is a decision to be made. So there's a certain sense in which, I want to say that for him, the authority of the biblical text is not necessarily dependent on a kind of ontological or historical knowledge.
Right.
It's dependent on the story that it conveys to us. And we're the ones, as human beings, I think sometimes that have drawn too tight a line between, and I'm just going to go ahead and use the word, myth and reality. And there is a certain sense in which the stories that we tell as human beings, and no matter what form they come to us in, convey to us a revelation or a power all of their own. This is one of the great things about, I hate to keep talking. This is one of the great things about that Frederick Buechner book. The Gospel is, what is the title? I can't remember the exact title, but it's The Gospel is Tragedy, Comedy, and Fairy Tale, where Buechner makes a really good point that sometimes the things that we think are fairy tales tell us the greatest truth of all.
Yeah.
And I think in some ways Bonhoeffer would say that what we have in the text or revelation is revelation, but that revelation is not necessarily tied to a particular understanding of the historical or the ontological.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember. I wish I knew where it was, but okay, I believe this. Bonhoeffer said this in my head, and if it didn't, I've projected it on him enough that I tell people Bonhoeffer said it in his head, Jeff. But in his kind of wrestling with Barth and Bonhoeffer, that entanglement, and then thinking about Bultmann. At some point, I remember him drawing a distinction between the revelation, using Christ as a model to think of revelation, because he says many a people encountered Jesus of Nazareth and never were seized by the Christ. And that isn't to say, right, that Jesus of Nazareth isn't in some sense determinative of the Christ. It's just that the event of revelation, Jesus becomes the Christ when, right? And if you think of like that synoptic story, when he asked the disciples, what do people say of me? Well, the options they give are like real literal ones that could happen in history. Maybe he is John the Baptist with his head back on, or maybe it's Elijah. He went up, or now you could think of historical Jesus. Maybe he's a wandering cynic sage, or he's internalized the identity of Israel in Second Temple period Judaism, or he's you go through these things. And in all those, like, in some sense, shape what it means for him to be the Christ. But then when Peter says, you're the Christ, son of the living God, Jesus goes, my Father in heaven revealed it to you, right? It wasn't the evidence demanded a verdict. It's that you now know yourself as known by God in Christ, and you now know God as revealed in this particular person. So in a sense, the word of God, Jesus, becomes the Christ in the encounter. That's how Christ becomes the center of everything in his Christology lectures. And you could say something like scripture becomes the word of God when, in reading it or in a proclamation or in the Eucharist, these kinds of things, God is reenacted in the reading. But there are plenty of people, and I have watched people's faces when I read scripture and preach, Jeff, that even on, I don't think it became the word of God to them. I think it became something keeping them from getting home for
An
Super Bowl.
offense. Yeah. Well,
no, even an offense would be better.
So anyway, so when we're going on about the sort of understanding of, and I guess you're referring to the, well, I thought it was in here somewhere, but I don't see it. Anyway, okay, go ahead. Sorry.
So I no, well, so I pulled up a couple Bultmann quotes that of places he gets similar he sounds similar to what Bonhoeffer does in Letters and Papers. And part of it, right, was this tension between, myth. And so when we hear it, no, that's a bad thing, or, history, and it kind of demands this. Karl Barth used the term saga, which is like, let's pick a different word so I can make sure I define how it works. But Barth had wrote to Bultmann after he started talking about demythologizing, and Bultmann's response was, I don't want to replace mythical thinking with the thinking of an objective science, because all world pictures need to be demythologized, right? And so he has this line. This is a Bultmann line. It is impossible to represent a past world picture by sheer resolve, especially a mythological world picture, now that all our thinking's irrevocably formed by science. It's impossible to use electric lights and the wireless and to avail ourselves of modern medical and surgical discoveries and at the same time believe the New Testament world of spirits and miracles. We may think we can manage it in our own lives, but to expect others to do so is to make the Christian faith unintelligible and unacceptable to the modern world. I don't want to replace mythical thinking with the thinking of an objectifying science either. Everyone knows that the results of science are relative and that any world picture worked out yesterday, today, or tomorrow can never be definitive. Faith insists on being freed from bondage to every world picture projected by objectifying thinking, whether it is the thinking of myth, or the thinking of science. All these assertions that constitute the gospel and the kerygma are an offense which will not be removed by philosophical discussion, but only by faith and obedience. And when I found that passage in like my, list of Bultmann material, thinking of the question, it reminds me so much of what Bonhoeffer's trying to wrestle with in Letters and Papers, of like a world come of age, religionless Christianity, God's not necessary, and even some of his critique of technology and stuff in Letters and Papers. Like, are there particular threads you see connected there that might give more insight to those reading it for the first time?
Well, I mean, that's a good sort of question. I think if I'm looking at Letters and Papers from prison, Bonhoeffer says, certainly with human beings coming of age, with humankind's coming of age, that is not a thing that we should try to fight, is not a thing that we should try to destroy. That is a thing that we should accept. And we should understand that is, in fact, a movement of history that has brought us to a point where human beings are just going to look at things from a different set of lenses than they might have had before. So say, for instance, the science lens. Bonhoeffer says this is not a thing to sort of eschew. And I don't have the text in front of me. I can, after I get off of this, I'm going to go look for it. But he invokes Bultmann at one point in Letters and Papers from prison. And he says he can't go, Bonhoeffer can't go with Barth's positivism of revelation. I think at one point he just says, Barth wants just everything all the way down the line, and everything is, this historically, accurate, factual, all the way down the line. Bonhoeffer can't go there, but he does say, in a certain sense, he comes back to Jesus. And he says, where do I find that story? I find that story in this particular text narrated by a community. And that community lives in a different time, a different place. Their interpretations of the world are different. But the power of that story and what it conveys to us remains. Now, I don't think that's particularly eloquent. Sorry. And while you're talking, I'm going to pull out my copy of Letters and Papers from prison, see if I can find it.
Yeah. I think one of the things, especially for people that are new to this conversation, when you think of today, there is a different kind of fragility that is just present in the West around any religious tradition's deepest convictions. When you think of what's happening in Europe, a lot of what, when we do the big history story of the West, a lot of the criticisms that were raised to religion for a long time are rather narrow to a particular class, the educated class, and existed in lots of the universities and such. But if you even went to the universities, the role and function of the Lutheran Church is high. I mean, Kant, late in his life, the Immanuel Kant, the philosopher that Bonhoeffer engages with early on in his career, has a whole book dedicated to complaining about how Lutheran pietism is rampant in the university, and it keeps them from thinking straight. And so when we go to read these texts, it's like a lot of us have grown up in a context that's multi-religious, where non-belief and non-participation is a full lived out possibility. When you think of coming out of World War I in Europe, there's like this awakening that what is Christendom doing in the West? It's now generated this great war. Then the nationalistic resentments starts to cultivate in the losers, the triumphalism of the winners. It starts to create tensions that exist culturally that start to problematize the confidence in those religious institutions. The enlightened liberals, the cosmopolitans of sort, that's where you get the birth of the ecumenical movement. The just looking at, like, say, divinity students who spent any time working in ecumenism after World War I is really where you start to see it take off. People are writing on it. You get a lot more interrelationship of the different denominations, and as they start to do that, is when you realize that there's a growing part of Western Europe that now can live a life without even having to nod towards the church. And so this question of demythologizing, the question of a world come of age, is coming on to the theological scene in World War II, at the time of World War II, and then with the rise of existentialism, with the kind of speed and going, what in the world? Like, think of all the questions no one thought of asking until COVID. And in the last 4 or 5 years, from COVID on, and then now we're thinking about nuclear war again. We have AI and no one knows what to do with it, but everyone's using it. Like, there are these times where all this stuff happens. And if you're inheriting this giant tradition, you go, well, what's up with that? How do we figure this out? What do we do? And there's a kind of energy taking place in like Barth, Bultmann, Bonhoeffer, Tillich, these individuals that were lived in this experience in wake of the First World War into the Second, and those that survived after, to go, the faith, the kerygma, the gospel, is it ultimately justified and supported by an institution that shapes our thinking so much we can't think otherwise? Or is the kerygma, the gospel, faith, justified by something else? If we cut out the institutions and the assumptions of culture dominance, is faith, gospel, kerygma ultimately justified by God? And one of the things that Barth, Bultmann, and Tillich, in different ways, and you get here in Bonhoeffer, is it's actually the event of Christ that grounds the potential for a church on the other side of this separation from culture dominant state religion. And that feels so different in the US, right? Just like, if you're from the US, our trajectory on that's looked different. There are certain questions we ask 50 years later, some we never ask because the state doesn't fund things. Well, unless the new Supreme Court gets their way, and this kind of thing.
Just real quick, just let me jump in there for a minute. Of course, you just opened up a whole host of concerns, but I want to go back to, it's a letter that Bonhoeffer wrote on May the 5th, 1944. And he says a few more words about religionlessness. You probably remember Bultmann's essay on demythologizing the New Testament. My opinion of it today would be that he went not too far, as most people thought, but rather not far enough. It's not only mythological concepts like miracles, ascension, and so on, which in principle can't be separated from concepts of God, faith, etc., that are problematic, but religious concepts as such. You can't separate God from the miracles, as Bultmann thinks. Instead, you must be able to interpret and proclaim them both non-religiously. Bultmann's approach is still basically liberal. And that is, it cuts the gospel short, whereas I'm trying to think theologically. What then does it mean to interpret religiously? And so, he is what would concepts like redemption, reconciliation, forgiveness, what are these concepts? Throughout Christian history, we use paradigms throughout Christian tradition to explain or talk about things that we find in the text. So Athanasius gives us a language to talk about Christ, or maybe atonement. Anselm gives us other languages to talk about sacrifice and atonement. Luther gives us certain languages to talk about Jesus and the relationship of church and state, of God hidden and revealed. Luther's in some ways he's very binary in his thinking. He's very dipolar in his sort of moving from one pole to the other in his thought. So all of these people give us languages to reconceptualize and reform and reshape Christianity in the age in which we live. And so for many people, they don't understand that those languages that emerged are not once and for all languages that should be used forever and for at all times, but that we are in a living stream of interaction with tradition. And that does not mean that languages that we are developing now, are thinking about now, are not going to be able to create new paradigms for the way that we think about faith, the way that we think about Christianity. Even as we sit embedded within the midst of the religion of Christianity, of the institutions that have emerged to keep that Christian story going, we still find ourselves sort of always in a constant state of movement, and that makes people existentially nervous. So as you well know, I was born again. I was evangelical Pentecostal. I believed in the inerrancy of Scripture. I was 19, and I hadn't quite yet been to seminary, which I'm sure many people thought made me lose my faith. But there's a certain point in which, if you have those touchstones and you can just kind of cling to those, that's a comfortable place to be. And Bonhoeffer, in some ways, he's letting go of some of his touchstones as well. He has to let go of his whole Lutheran upbringing in some ways, to rethink about, what will a church look like in the new age? And one of the most interesting things he says in Outline for a Book is he says, what the church might look like in the future is that we dismantle the church. We sell it all. We sell the buildings. We dismantle the church. Pastors work in normal jobs, and it's not that we give up community, but that we give up the edifice that we've constructed to kind of that kind of functions to how do I want to say this? To imprison us within particular theologies, right? So the German Christians had a theology. Hitler had a theology. Everybody has a theology when you scratch the surface of some point or the other. So all of these theologies work to imprison us. And Bonhoeffer is saying, how do we escape that prison? And you might say, yeah, that's Freudian projection because he's in prison and he wants to escape. But there's something, I think, deeper that goes on with him here. And, in that Outline for a Book, when he comes out and he says, okay, so what does the church look like in the future? Well, it's not necessarily going to be tied to all of the sort of traditional paradigms of the past, but it might need new paradigms. It might need new understandings of itself. But this is the really cool part. he says that in some ways, even if we have to find new frames of thinking for this, the performative aspects, the practices of prayer, righteous action, Eucharist, fasting, he says there are certain practices that will need to carry forward into the future as we start thinking, because in some ways those practices, without saying a word, can convey to us the concepts of redemption, reconciliation, union with God. Now I want to go back to something you just said just a minute ago, because we're going to have new discussions. We're having new discussions now, and you put your finger on a new discussion we're going to have. And this is an interesting place, because for Bonhoeffer, the discussion is always about human beings. What is the human being? And what is the relationship between human beings? And how does that relate to the transcendent? So when we move into the world of AI, all of those discussions are going to be very, very interesting, aren't they?
Oh
What
yeah.
is the human if this can do everything that a human can do? I mean, this is why in some ways the Matrix was so powerful, in its own crazy, lovely, wonderful way, because it starts to raise questions about what is the human,
Hmm.
and what is the mind in the machine, and those are going to be new questions. So how is Christian faith going to respond to that? And let me just say that the populist Jesus, or the populist Bonhoeffer of American Christianity, is not up to the task of developing languages to talk about the new realities that are coming our way.
Yeah. Yeah. It is. In the AI thing is, I think, a great example. Like, um, for years, 3 years in each semester, I would do a lecture on AI, in science and religion classes. And just in like the last 3 months, the number of students that were like, "Hey, do you happen to have that video of your lecture from lockdown on AI?" And I'm like, the one you were in the class for? And we're like, "Oh, this isn't that interesting." And now they're all having it. And I know you taught, you were interested in it and did religion and science stuff. It's fascinating how there are these like topics that a few people talk about for a long time, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, I guess this is where we're going.
Yeah.
Um, do you?
I don't want to get too far away from Bonhoeffer, but
Oh, I know it,
that's,
but I'm more than happy to have AI conversations with you
I
later.
know. Well, let's talk. Let's get Noreen Hirschfeld into
Yeah.
a podcast.
So, one of the questions that came in specifically around that tension was, on the relationship between what he's calling arcane disciplines, and you've hinted at it there. And what would it mean to be, uh, a religionless Christianity and the arcane disciplines? Like, could you kind of help him putting both of those forward, kind of mutually interpret, what that, the kind of conservation he's thinking? Like, I'm conserving arcane disciplines, I'm doing religionless Christianity.
Yeah, so you see, in the certain way in which religion is that humanly constructed um, aspect, and this is global. I mean, this is not just Christianity, but we've talked about this before. Religion functions as a way to justify and legitimate structures that we ourselves are building to interpret the world, and to respond to the world as we build it. There's always a continual feedback loop. We create the computer's going to end up creating something in us. We create technologies in us. So we create religion in a certain sense. It's a human creation, Christianity included, and then we construct a religion. And as we're constructing a religion, certain justifications enter into the constructions themselves. So, like, for instance, okay, so, and I'm going to offend some people here, I guess, but that's all right. If you look at um, the construction of karma, That is an airtight, rational doctrine to explain some of the most intractable problems in the world. Why do we suffer? Suffer because you have bad karma. Suffer because you're paying your karmic debt. I mean, if you go into in depth, and you sort of start to look at that thinking, that religious structure of what we label as Hinduism is built to deal with a lot of existential issues. And it builds a completely rational world that operates in that. And then so that now, that person isn't suffering because your society has constructed a world that ultimately the rich and the powerful are trying to maintain so that they can maintain their dominance over the rest of the society. No, that person suffers because of something they did in a former life. Well, Christianity does the same thing. It performs the same functions, especially once it takes the power of the state to enable it to have the power of those functions, be able to sort of create those structures, that sacred umbrella over society. Well, so what happens then if those structures disappear? So for instance, let's go back to something I just mentioned earlier. What if Bonhoeffer, when he's writing that outline for a book, and he says, one of the first things we're going to have to do is make sure that we sell all of the churches. And here's where he says it. He says it in his outline for a book. And excuse me, I'm sorry. It's in the Dietrich Bonhoeffer Works English. It's on page 502. And he says, 503. He says, the church is church only when it exists for others. As a first step, it must give away all its property to those in need. Well, once you give away property, you're giving away power, right? So Bonhoeffer says the clergy must live solely on the free will offerings of the congregations. Some must be engaged in secular. The church must participate in the worldly task of the life of the community, not dominating but helping. There's a certain sense in which, if Christianity moves to its foundations of vulnerability, of servants, I want to say servanthood, but that's a word from my past, of being present in the human struggle and being present with humans, finding God in the neighbor. The edifice of church may disappear, but the core, prayer, righteous action, attention and mindfulness to God, and the one that I really appreciate in the Arcane Disciplines is Eucharist. You can have Eucharist, and you can have it without the church building, because we have a story. Eucharist tells a story, tells us who we are. You can have Eucharist, and I think this is the point that Bonhoeffer is making about what is it that we really believe. You can have Eucharist. Do you have to believe in the doctrine of transubstantiation for the power of Eucharist to make itself known? And in Bonhoeffer's case, do you even have to accept the notion of real presence the way that Luther explains it, in contradistinction to transubstantiation? So there's a certain sense in which maybe the practices themselves will be released from a kind of structure that has imprisoned them in the dead weight of doctrine.
Yeah.
And I know that makes people nervous. It makes us all nervous. It makes me a little nervous because I want there to be, I want my position set and stuff. But there's a certain sense, and I think you were alluding to it earlier, in which if you find the foundations will always be there.
Yeah. And like even that example, right, of how karma in some sense is answering similar questions, Christians will answer it this way. I think part of what Bonhoeffer is getting at is like, no, humans are going to have those questions and they're going to keep asking them. And And guess what? We have those answers today, even if you're completely not religious. If you ask the question of why, if you ask most Americans, the foreign policy elite, why we need to be in charge of everything, they'll give you a theodicy, a historical necessity. If we think back to some of Bonhoeffer's reflections earlier, where like this is just how the world works. We need this, like the post-World War II consensus, and us running all the global mediation things. If we think about, we asked a question of theodicy around poverty. Well, the market gives us a theodicy. Well, people are free. If you get the grit, you get the gain. We live in a meritocracy. So when you see someone is poor, you see failed responsibility. And I guess we might help their kids if we have to. And then once, as the boomers get older, we get scared about cutting their retirement. But we have all these. We keep giving stories to justify reality, and I think part of what Bonhoeffer raises to the fore, especially in Letters and Papers, like Christ being pushed out on the cross, the weakness is that when understood, the cross can never be the justification for the domination system. It can't be what makes normal the powers and principalities of our day. It kind of necessarily remains a cross, even if you use lynching trees, or even if you use nukes, or even if you use wars of nationalism that are necessity because of these kind of things.
So when he says that we live in the world as if God does not exist, and then he says in another place in Letters and Papers from Prison, before God and with God, we live in the world as without God. God is not a thing that we can automatically assume. Let me rephrase this. The way that God interacts with the world is not necessarily assumptions that we can make about how that happens. So if human beings are if they've managed everything, if we have sort of moved to the pragmatic teleology of effectiveness as the logic within which we construct our systems, and those systems basically deal with, more things than not, keep things on the level, then we really don't need God. But that does not mean that, and God is not present in some ways. But Bonhoeffer says that the how do I want to say this? That God is constantly present in my neighbor, the imago Dei, or the theosis. God is constantly present in my neighbor. And there's that great line in the movie Romero, the story of Archbishop Oscar Romero, terrific movie. And I'm so glad that Raul Julia did that, and so I have something other than the Addams Family to remember him by, or Kiss of the Spider Woman. But in that movie, the words of Romero, it's a priest who Romero's sort of chiding for living among the people and sort of being liberation theology adjacent. And the priest says to Romero, "How can I love God whom I cannot see if I do not love my brother who I can?" Right? And he's obviously saying something very powerful about human community, but the ways in which we think God is interacting in the world, for Bonhoeffer, I don't think we can think that way anymore. And where it shows up in popular thinking, like God has a reason for everything, or everything happens for a reason, maybe better stated. Maybe it doesn't. And pretty much most of the people that I know have come to understand that not everything happens for a reason. There's not necessarily some massive controlling aspect behind everything that happens, because then you have a model of God there that I think Bonhoeffer is opposing, because he's seen what's happening in his culture and he's saying there's no way God is involved in this.
Yeah. All right. There are a number of questions about your close, dear personal friend Eric Mataxis, legendary Bonhoeffer scholar. I don't know if you know him, Dr. Pugh. But here's one of them, and I mean you can really take it wherever you want because there are enough questions about this, but it seems clear, engaging the academic work around Bonhoeffer, that the version Metaxas describes is oft, and there's been little engagement with the other constructive historical works in his own. But what could we learn, or should we learn, when we look at the attractiveness of this Bonhoeffer in our current moment?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question.
And I'll just say there is a conversation that's linked to on the resource page with Stephen
Hayes.
that last time we did
Haynes.
and it there you go. The Battle for Bonhoeffer's the book. Jeff and I talked to him for a while, and it digs very much into this, but that's why I really like this particular question, Jeff, about what do you think we're learning that the Metaxas version comes out as attractive, and then since then there's been the attachment of Metaxas and that world to Trump, growth in Christian nationalism, and that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm going to come at it from a sideways position for just a minute. I don't know of any human being that thinks of themselves as immoral or evil or bad. I really, it'd be few and far between that I came into, I'm doing this because I just love evil shit. Most of us want to do the right thing. And so when somebody comes along and says, I know you want to do the right thing. Well, here's a very simple answer for you. And I'm just going to go ahead and take the really hot button issue in American society today, abortion. Somebody comes along and says, here, you can save innocent lives if you want to. And you're thinking to yourself, I'm a good person. I want to save innocent lives. And here is a very easy, understood position to take. You are protecting the innocent. And then along comes Eric Metaxas, and he says, this is exactly what Bonhoeffer did. He spoke out against abortion. And there's a place in ethics where Bonhoeffer does, in fact, speak out against abortion. So now you've combined your desire to be a moral human being. I don't think all of the folks that are out there working, who are anti-abortion are necessarily bad or evil or wrong. Most of my friends and people that I associate with see them as being a danger to human autonomy and a serious danger to women's health. And I think that we have to look at that and understand that because they're not going to on the other side. But if you're somebody that wants to do good in the world, somebody like Metaxas comes along and says, you know what? You're not the only Christians that thought this. This other Christian, he fought the freaking Nazis. You know what I'm saying? And because we have made the Nazis the paradigm of evil forever, and Hitler has become a fetish in some ways of evil in that sense, then that moral line or that moral boundary becomes an easily understood thing. Oh, look, that guy opposed the Nazis and he also opposed abortion. So if you oppose abortion now, you're also opposing the Nazis who are trying to shove that down your throat. Now, am I being too polemical here? I cannot be more polemical than Eric Metaxas has been in his life and in his career. I just cannot be. The reason that there are different Bonhoeffers is that Bonhoeffer himself is full of contradictions. And what Stephen Haynes in his book really does sort of center himself on is the populist Bonhoeffer. And the populist Bonhoeffer was used by all across the theological spectrum. He was a liberationist, and everybody always wants to know, are we in a Bonhoeffer moment? And the right-wing Bonhoeffer was catapulted into the American discussion by Eric Mataxis' biography on Bonhoeffer. Now, I don't want to go through all the flaws and all the mistakes and all the questions on that, but what I am going to say is that is one case in which, people that understand Bonhoeffer, that have been working at this for a long time, were just looking at that, shaking their head, going, "Holy hell! What have you done with my Bonhoeffer? Where hast you taken my Bonhoeffer?" Because they did not recognize the American evangelical tinged populist Bonhoeffer that came out of Eric's book. Now, having said this, I don't think Eric Metaxas is an evil person, but he sees Bonhoeffer as a moral exemplar, the same way he used Wilberforce in an earlier book that Metaxas did. But it's interesting that Eric says he wants to protect Bonhoeffer from all of the academics and all of the leftists, and he wants to bring Bonhoeffer back, to where he belongs, which is in the right wing. So in some ways, Bonhoeffer has become a shorthanded way to claim any number of moral positions. But for Metaxas, his moral position ended up being sort of really out there on the far right. And the complex story that I've said is Bonhoeffer's life, and that many people are talking about, that gets lost in a kind of simplistic rendering of Bonhoeffer. So now Bonhoeffer, if you accept that the premise that Eric brings to the biography, if you accept his narrative, then in some senses, to oppose whatever it is that Eric is opposing is by de facto aligning yourself with the Nazis in a certain sense. And this rhetoric, really picks up in American society. And this is why Stephen's book is great. And I hope our conversation of him was coherent. I haven't listened to it since we recorded it. But the shift when Obama is elected president, the shift of rhetoric in American society was just off the charts, and this is why I'm very hesitant to draw a clear line between 1933 and our time, because then it was Obama's just like Hitler, Obama is Hitler, Hitlery, Clinton, and what emerges on the political right is and driven no small part because of these theologies and ideologies of people like Metaxas, is that resistance is just like the confessing church's resistance to the Nazis. We are in a Bonhoeffer moment, and in this Bonhoeffer moment, we must stand up. It is in Statu Confessionis. We're at a moment in which, it's the existential moment of the church, and everything hinges on this moment. Well, you want to know what that moment really was for them? Was the Supreme Court decision Obergefell, I may be pronouncing that wrong, in the gay marriage decision in the Supreme Court. And that was it. That was the moment which they said, okay, now we have to lay our bodies and we have to destroy the state. The state cannot go on as it is. We have to be the spoke in the wheels of the hub. They're asking us to accept immorality. We cannot do this anymore. So Metaxas leads that charge. And sorry, Metaxas leads that charge. His biography of Bonhoeffer sells over 1 million copies. Well, right. I could say, yay, I that's awesome. And it was enormously influential because it had an enormously powerful right-wing media industry behind it. Reviews in Wall Street Journal, reviews in the best journals, interviews in Fox News, so that the Bonhoeffer that many conservative American evangelicals believe in is the one that is mediated and narrated to them by Mataxis in his book. But when you go back and you look at Mataxis' book, I don't see the Bonhoeffer that I've been studying 30 years or 35 years. I don't see that Bonhoeffer there. I see a one-dimensional, almost cartoonish Bonhoeffer that fits well into an American right-wing evangelical narrative, and that can be trotted out when the state can be opposed. But what happens then when you and Eric Metaxas worked very hard for Trump to be elected? What happens then when your guy gets elected? All of a sudden, that resistance to the state drops away, because now the state is going to give you the fondest desires of your heart, which means now it's a Christian state. It's going to give you a Supreme Court that's going to outlaw abortion. Now it's a Christian state. It's going to enable certain things to happen. And so what you end up with is a Christianity whose main motivator is a lust for policy in the political order to instantiate its own morality. Do you not even believe in Jesus enough to sort of to move into the world in spaces of persuasion, of talking, of living with people, of being with people, to the point where, yeah, okay, so if I just pass a law, I can get this done. Yeah, you can pass all the laws you want to. That's not going to change the inner relationship of human beings. It's not going to change the relationship between human beings to one another. And so all your policy lust, if they slake your desires, if you gain the whole world, but you lose your soul. I'm sorry, I feel like I just went into preaching. And I apologize for that. I'm trying to wrap this rant up in something that I hope is succinct. The problem with the populist Jesus of the right wing is that it is not a Jesus that is able to be sufficiently critical of the power of the state in whoever's hands it's in. It is not a Jesus who, when you are gathered at the table, the Eucharistic table, accepts all who are at that table just as they are, no matter what their sexual orientation, no matter what their race, no matter, whatever. I mean, this is a hard place for me. That there is a kind of fencing of Christianity that takes place in this Bonhoeffer that says, oh, all the liberals suck ass and they can't be a part of the community. Now, I may have my critiques to make about the kinds of things that Mataxis has given us. When he writes the foreword to a book on the faith of Donald Trump, I just have to say, so, okay. I don't want to go back to my evangelical days necessarily, but Matthew 7:20 says, wherefore by their fruits you shall know them. What are the fruits? Oh, well, we got the Supreme Court. Is that a fruit? Did that make the abortion rates go down? Is that leading to the health of human beings? If you are pro-life, great. Then why are you still out there justifying the production of nuclear weapons or of AR-15s to flood American society into more and more slaughter on American streets? If you're going to be pro-life, but don't be pro-life in the sense that, it just functions in this one way. And I'm going to use Bonhoeffer's fight against the Nazis to say that that's exactly what I'm doing. Now, if you want to, folks, if people are listening to this, and I know that there are people all along the theological spectrum on this thing, but if you want to sort of get good understandings of Mataxis and Bonhoeffer and the sort of critical guild, that book by Haynes is a good place to start, because he
And I
does lay
dropped
it
the
out.
link in the chat.
He does lay it out about the way in which Mataxis was a certain accelerant to I think employing Bonhoeffer as a warrior in the culture wars. When I'm not sure that's where Bonhoeffer is best understood or situated. Sorry.
Oh no, Jeff. No. I know your the voice steroids starts waning. So I have okay, I'll do 3 more questions, and a number of them are short, so you can go wherever you want with it. And I'll let everyone that's in the thing now, but also in the class, feel free to keep sending more questions. One, some of them may make sense with some of our guests coming up, or we might do some answer some more of them at the end of things, especially if the topics match things we're reading. There are a couple of them that match stuff we're reading in 2 weeks. And I was like, oh, we'll talk about them then. There's a couple more specific ministry related. I was going to save them and we'll talk about them when Andy Root's here and such. Now here's one I was very interested in. Jeff, you taught Bonhoeffer for a long time to undergrad students. You've talked about Elon having a mix of religious backgrounds and familiarity coming in. What was the most energizing or attractive part of Bonhoeffer in reading it with students? Was there a particular question or text that helped the conversation come alive? One of the there is a list of questions about your time teaching, and one of them said, one of them said, did it change? Right, if you think about the first few times you taught Bonhoeffer to towards the end of your time, now that you're professor emeritus, that when students met Bonhoeffer over that time, did their interest or connections change?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Of course, one of my students, Ryan. I guess you could ask him, if he remembers anything about that. Maybe he never took that class. I think one of the things, I never taught Bonhoeffer in isolation from, Bonhoeffer was a part of a larger class section on the church and the Holocaust. So I never taught Bonhoeffer as Bonhoeffer, but he was always in the discussion as to what happened to Christianity in 1933, 1932. And so for that, I would have to say that one of the things that most surprised my students was how strong Christian anti-Semitism has been through the entirety of Christianity. So when I made the argument to my students that the German Christians used Luther as a cultural hero and his writings on the Jews written in the 1540s, printing out select quotations and pamphlets to distribute in churches, that Kristallnacht happens on the eve of Luther's birthday is not an accident, right? So, and then I, because I would come in with the class and I would say, Nazis didn't cause the Holocaust, Christians did. And the students would immediately start responding, no, that's not true. And then we would start to unpack the way that Christianity has interpreted Judaism right out of the gate. And we would spend some time on that. So that when we get to Bonhoeffer, and they've, and I don't want to say it was hagiography, because I did try to, show the difficulties and the compromises that Bonhoeffer makes. But when we get to Bonhoeffer, there's this sense that at least someone was, working on the other side of the fence. I mean, it's not just Bonhoeffer, it's other confessing church members and stuff. But then, I problematized the confessing church for them by showing how a lot of the confessing church ended up giving the oath of allegiance to Hitler. And a lot of them themselves were anti-Jewish. The Barmen Declaration doesn't speak out on behalf of Jews. So I would say that I don't know that anything changed, but I tried to contextualize Bonhoeffer in that larger context of the confessing church struggle. And I do think that what students appreciated, and I still do appreciate this, was the notion that for all of his cultural captivity, Bonhoeffer saw and understood something that others did not. And he was able to escape that ethnocentric dilemma, that sort of epistemological bubble that we can find ourselves in sometimes, to see and view the world from another place. And I swear to God, if they came out of that class thinking there are other ways of looking at the world than the one that I've been taught all my life, if they came out thinking that, then that was a job well done. And I'm pretty sure that would put me on the hate list of a lot of different state legislatures for indoctrinating people. But they did come out. I think they did. I did try to express in class the really deep appreciation for that move that Bonhoeffer makes in 1939 when he returns to Germany after being safe. I think I really, that is a moment of moral courage.
Yeah.
And is something that I do find to admire there.
All right.
I'm not sure that answered the question.
No, well, but I mean, there were a number of them, but they were all connected to some. It was a giant list of questions about teaching it, and that was you talking about teaching it.
Well, and always in context.
All right. So, what's your favorite letter?
Oh,
see, that's a hard one. You got a book that goes through a bunch of them.
I don't know. Those letters start on April the 30th. Hold on just a minute. I'm sort of. So maybe that April the 30th and the letters that follow it, where he just starts his working out of this. And he says, what might surprise, or perhaps even worry you, would be my theological thoughts and where they're leading. So, for instance, this is another thing about Mataxis that is so disturbing to me. Bonhoeffer comes to this moment in his life, and these are not 3 or 4 pages that Bonhoeffer would reject if he had been let free from prison, the way that Eric talks about it in the book. He absolutely discounts any theology emerging from letters and papers from prison. But Bonhoeffer is sort of looking at the sum of his life in conversation with some of the most brilliant European thinkers of Western and ancient thinkers of civilization. And he's what does law mean? What does what does science mean? How are we constructing the world? He's this wide-ranging conversation. And he says to his best friend, you may be a little concerned about where my thoughts are leading me. That's an honest statement, right? So yeah. I'm not sure it's my favorite, but and then he starts to go on and he says, look, what if Christianity is just the preliminary stage of religion? Mm-hmm. It's a place where the honest willingness to drive down to the very core of things.
Yeah.
And ask the question. And this reminds me, by the way, of I remember another session somebody was saying there's too much deconstruction here. What about the reconstruction? And the reconstruction is in some ways the part that gives you a deeper, more profound appreciation for grace, gives you a deeper and more profound appreciation for the God that you cannot control. The reconstruction is the space where you are constructing the theology that is yours. It was not necessarily taught to you. You internalize it in a way that maybe you had not internalized the theology that you deconstructed.
Yeah.
And even at the end of his life as a Christian theologian, there's still space for Bonhoeffer to ask the question, am I on the right track? And what I'm talking about, is it empty theory? Is it the Freudian projection of my own fears, or is it having to do with the transcendence that actually exists and informs the world?
Yeah.
Down to the smallest molecule.
Oh, so okay.
No,
So
we're not going there, but
I know what you know, I'm like, oh, 3 quick questions. And then it's like, Tripp, do you want to have a detour into science and religion and divine action?
no, sorry. I was baiting you.
Well, I know. Look, just imagine his letters that everyone reads are probably similar to our, if someone like just found our ongoing text exchange from the last 4 years. They were like, that's what they were thinking. So there was a number of questions that came in around this. Also in the chat, Gary said this topic of the dominant culture religion is what I'm struggling with. We're spiritually formed by an ecocidal civilization. Our churches are formed not by Jesus, but by complicity with radical evil. There were questions that raised it, especially in response to where we ended with Reggie, right? About recognizing this distinction between religion and a community of faith, and when you were there describing that task of people like, oh, we got to get to the, what do we do with the reconstruction element? This image come to mind, and that I've been thinking of what is it like to have a kind of Christocentric kind of reconstructive move like that Bonhoeffer kind of offers, right, in the Letters and Papers, a sense of we got to relearn to speak, but also it's grounded in these practices that take place in communities and these narratives that shape the practices. I think a lot of people in our process of differentiating, right, that culture dominant expression of religion, it's like you have that in one hand, and then the faith of connected to Christ in the other. And a lot of people are like getting further and further away from the institutional religion and this dominant culture religion, and they're feeling like really pulled, right? And so that part of the reconstruction thing is they want to bring it back together again in some way. And I think what Bonhoeffer's getting at is like, no, you're not helping get Jesus into this space. You're actually like not going anywhere. You're all of you with this kind of deep anxiety, or why Jesus is tethered to shitty dominant culture, domination system friendly religion. You just need to let it go. The reconstructive process is only an anxiety, fear building thing when you think that you're now responsible to building something to tether Jesus to. No, you just walk off with it, right? And then we'll figure it out. But how is it? He has a kind of confidence that I think a lot of us struggle with, especially leaders in religious traditions, where you're like, oh no, the only place I've ever encountered him is over here. Also, like, my job's over here. Also, like, I want my kids to know the stories enough to even deconstruct a bad version of it to then still understand their parents who Jesus matters a lot to. Or you got this whole thing. And I think what Bonhoeffer is seeing, and it is a sense that no, you need to let go. Who even knows how far away from it you'll walk? It's just as long as you think, as long as your faith in some way is like tethering the support structure for culture and dominance to the crucified one, then it's going to be uncomfortable, and the people on the other side of the domination system are going to falsify in the brokenness of their bodies your confession. Anyway, what do you think about that? Because I like Gary's question is there. We got a number of them. about, what do you do? But I think Bonhoeffer's invitation has this kind of radical Christocentrism to it that isn't always like the dominant option in current conversation.
I'm just going to go ahead and start with his outline for a book, where he said stock taking of Christianity, and he talks about the worldliness of human beings. And he says, before we had to deal with the world of nature, unprotected, but now with the the sort of emergence of the Homo autonomous, we are protected by insurance, and he says by organizations. And organizations have built the shell around the human being that in some ways isolates it from nature. And the church participates in this, whether it's an economic shell or whether it's a technological shell or whatever it is. We are now living in the conditions where we're destroying nature and we don't even understand what we're doing. And there's a certain sense in which a Bonhoeffer move says all of those techniques, organizations, or whatever that have given us the freedom and autonomy have ended up imprisoning us. And until we dismantle those structures in a certain way, and we understand our relationship to nature in a certain way, we're creating the conditions for our own self-destruction. I think that's what I heard. That is the sort of core of, or read. I mean, the question just popped up there for a minute and then went away. And in as much as the church participates in that, it is also an ecocidical, I'm not sure if that's the right word that he used, but it is also a humanity earth-killing entity. It is a religion that has been disconnected from the very source of creation. Now, I want to go ahead and say here that the church does have a story about creation that could be very different than the story that technologies and science offer us, and about who it is that we are related to in the created order. That could be very powerful for paths forward. Let me just stop there. I'm having a moment.
Oh yeah, well, and we don't need to go too long. I know you're we're maxing you out here, but thank you, Jeff. I've really enjoyed this, and I know Jeff comes on the podcast regularly on top of whenever we have get to do classes together. So definitely send in any other questions and such. If you've already sent them in there, they still exist in a giant Google Doc. I try to power rank things that show up multiple times.
And we can hold those questions for later sessions.
Yeah. And some of them fit for topics that are coming up. But Jeff, thank you for the perseverance. And thank you all for joining. And Monday you'll get the next lecture and such, and then we'll see you next Thursday in the live stream.
I want to just say a word about Jenny McBride. She is the president of the International Bonhoeffer Society English Language Edition of the American Academy of Religion. She is a Bonhoeffer scholar who is a prison activist in Atlanta, Georgia. She gave up a teaching position at McCormick Seminary, and she's now an Episcopal priest and was very walked closely with Kelly Gissender. I'm not sure I got that right name. The woman who was executed, who had converted to Christianity, but was still executed by the state of Georgia. So she might have some things to say about what prison means and how it changes us. And I'm sorry for any. Sorry, I'm gonna probably just stop now.
All right. Well, we'll see you all next week. This has been a blast. I love not just you, Jeff, but getting to talk with you too. So this has been awesome. See you all next week.
Sorry for the coughing.